Thanks for the clarification. I'll analyze the future of US-Iran-Israel relations over the next 3 years using game theory and political tools. This will include assessments of nuclear policy, military conflict risk, diplomatic strategies, and sanctions. I'll incorporate academic and expert think tank perspectives, explore multiple scenarios, and consider broader regional players like Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. I'll also assess the likelihood of regime change in Iran. I'll get started and share the findings with you shortly. Future of the US-Iran-Israel trilateral relationship, 2025 to 2028. Introduction. The trilateral relationship between the United States, Iran, and Israel is entering a critical juncture in 2025. The coming 3 years will be shaped by high-stakes interactions over Iran's nuclear program. The potential for open conflict, including cyber warfare, shifting diplomatic alignments, and the impact of economic sanctions. This report uses game theory and political science frameworks to analyze these dynamics. Drawing on academic literature, policy think tank insights, and current geopolitical developments, multiple plausible scenarios are explored, from uneasy stalemate to diplomatic breakthroughs or conflict, and the most likely trajectories are identified based on present trends and strategic decision-making behavior. In addition, a separate assessment is provided on the prospects for regime change in Iran by 2028. Considering historical precedents, internal pressures, and elite dynamics, strategic framework, a trilateral game of survival and deterrence. At the core of the US-Iran-Israel triangle is a strategic game of deterrence and brinkmanship. Each player's overriding objective can be seen in game theoretic terms. Israel seeks to prevent an existential threat from a nuclear-armed Iran. Iran seeks regime survival and regional influence, using its nuclear program as leverage or insurance. And the United States aims to prevent nuclear proliferation while maintaining regional stability and its own interests, including the security of Israel and Gulf oil flow. The interaction often resembles a multiplayer game of chicken. Each side brandishes threats, military strikes, nuclear advancement, sanctions, hoping the others will swerve or concede. Yet the risk of miscalculation is severe, as none can fully back down without heavy strategic costs. This creates a security dilemma. Defensive steps by one actor, e.g. Iran expanding its nuclear program for deterrence, are interpreted as offensive threats by the others, prompting counter-actions that reinforce mutual suspicion. Over 2025 to 2028, this strategic deadlock may persist, with each side attempting to alter the game's payoff structure through alliances, economic pressure, or calibrated escalation to force the other's hand without triggering disastrous conflict. Game theory concepts like credible commitments and brinkmanship help explain the behavior. For instance, Israel's repeated signals that it is willing to strike Iranian nuclear facilities if pushed to the brink serve as a commitment device to deter Iran's nuclear breakout. Meanwhile, Iran engages in nuclear ambiguity and tit-for-tat escalation, advancing its program incrementally in response to pressure while stopping short of the weapons threshold, thereby extracting concessions or time while avoiding a trigger for war. Each actor is also influenced by domestic politics. A two-level game. U.S. leaders weigh domestic opinion and election outcomes when forming Iran policy. Iran's regime uses external threats to rally internal support, and Israeli decision-makers face public expectations for security. This complex strategic backdrop sets the stage for examining specific domains of the relationship. Nuclear policy and proliferation. Status of Iran's nuclear program. 2025. Since the U.S. withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA. In 2018, Iran has dramatically expanded its nuclear capability. Tehran has enriched uranium up to 60% U-235, just short of weapons grade, and amassed significant stockpiles, operating advanced centrifuges and even building out new enrichment facilities. Importantly, Iran has not yet made a known decision to build a nuclear weapon, and U.S. intelligence assessments still indicate Iran's leadership has stopped short of a full weapons program. However, the technological progress, including enrichment near 90% in at least one instance, means Iran is a de facto threshold nuclear state. Its breakout time, the time to amass fissile material for one bomb, has shrunk to mere weeks or even days in some estimates. Iran continues to cooperate selectively with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, to avoid a referral to the UN Security Council, but it has stonewalled full inspections of suspect sites and activities. JCPOA and the diplomacy deadlock. Efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear deal have thus far failed. By mid-2025, prospects for a comprehensive return to JCPOA constraints had dimmed considerably. The Biden administration's early attempts at indirect negotiations, 2021-2022, stalled, and subsequent back-channel talks have yielded no breakthrough. Iran demanded substantial sanctions relief and guarantees against future U.S. withdrawal, while Washington insisted Iran reverse its nuclear advances and agree to follow on talks about missiles and regional behavior. These gaps proved difficult to bridge. As a result, Iran steadily breached JCPOA limits without incurring new UN sanctions, creating an equilibrium of inaction. By late 2024, Iran keeps its nuclear advances below the weapons-grade threshold, and Western powers maintain sanctions but refrain from drastic steps, each side fearing that pushing harder could provoke the other into a worst-case response. Decisive deadlines, snapback and sunset provisions. The year 2025 is a turning point due to expiring UN measures. October 18, 2025 marks the final opportunity for JCPOA parties to trigger the snapback mechanism at the UN, which would reimpose all international sanctions lifted under the deal. After that date, remaining UN restrictions, already weakened by the lapse of the arms embargo in 2020 and missile restrictions in 2023, will mostly sunset. European powers, Britain, France, Germany, and the US face a dilemma: trigger snapback to punish Iran's violations, and risk Iran retaliating by quitting the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, as Tehran has threatened, or let the deadline pass, which Iran would read as a green light to continue expanding its program. Iran has explicitly warned that if snapback is invoked in late 2025, it will exit the NPT, removing even the baseline international inspections and raising the specter of an open dash to a bomb. Thus, a high-stakes game of chicken looms. The West must decide whether to pull the snapback trigger, and Iran is signaling that doing so would blow up the remaining framework of restraint. Potential nuclear trajectories. Given this context, the 2025 to 2028 period could see divergent outcomes. Scenario 1. A new nuclear agreement or JCPOA+. In a more optimistic case, intensified diplomacy yields an agreement that reins in Iran's program in exchange for sanctions relief. This could be either a revival of JCPOA with updated terms or a fresh interim deal. What might drive it? A mutual realization that the status quo is untenable, Iran's economy is under strain, and the risk of Israeli military action is growing. Notably, even some hardliners in Tehran have hinted that economic salvation lies in a deal limiting the nuclear program. On the U.S. It is quite plausible that Iran will neither weaponize nor compromise in the next 3 years, but rather continue its current strategy of staying just below the red line. Under this scenario, Iran incrementally improves its nuclear know-how, e.g. refining centrifuge efficiency, accumulating 60% stockpile, without testing a weapon, while Israel and the US continue covert sabotage and pressure but stop short of direct military strikes. This is essentially a protracted non-cooperative game that falls short of open collision, a form of repeated brinkmanship. Iran benefits from the ambiguity, having a latent nuclear capability that bolsters its deterrence and bargaining power, yet by not weaponizing, it avoids crossing the tripwire that could unite the world, and especially provoke military action against it. The costs to Iran of this strategy are ongoing economic pain from sanctions and the risk of sudden strikes if Israel loses patience. The costs to the US-Israel are the strategic distraction and uncertainty of a continually inching nuclear program. This uneasy status quo can only last as long as all players tacitly prefer it to the alternatives. Notably, Western powers have been reluctant to escalate Iran's case to the UN or consider military options, so long as Iran's program advances without a bomb, preferring to contain it via sanctions and covert ops. Iran, for its part, has been careful, so far, not to overtly expel IAEA inspectors or enrich uranium to 90% in large quantities, thus avoiding the point of no return. This scenario, while unstable, could persist into 2028 if no actor is willing to risk the high consequences of a break from the equilibrium. Israel's preventive strike calculus. Israel views Iran's nuclear progress through a lens of existential threat and preventive war theory. Israeli leaders have consistently signaled that if international diplomacy fails, Israel will act alone to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities rather than allow Iran to get the bomb. This threat is credible to a large degree. Israel has a track record of striking nuclear sites. Iraq 1981, Syria 2007, and enjoys a qualitative military edge in the region. However, the Iran case is far more challenging. Iran's facilities are numerous, hardened, Fordow is buried deep underground, and Iran can retaliate via missiles and proxies. In previous years, Israel reportedly hesitated to strike without at least tacit U.S. backing, fearing a regional war with Hezbollah's massive rocket arsenal. But recent shifts may embolden Israel. Notably, after the Hamas war of 2023 and subsequent clashes, Iran's proxy network has been weakened, Hezbollah suffered blows and lost leaders, and Iran's air defenses were partially degraded by Israeli actions in 2024. Israeli officials began arguing that Iran's nuclear sites are more exposed than ever to attack. If Israeli intelligence judges that Iran is irreversibly crossing towards weapons capability, Israel might calculate that a strike, even without U.S. participation, is a better gamble than tolerating a nuclear-armed Iran. Game theory's concept of a commitment strategy is evident here. By repeatedly affirming its willingness to go to war, essentially burning the bridge to any strategy of passive acceptance, Israel tries to convince both Washington and Tehran that someone will act before Iran gets a bomb, altering the latter two's calculations. This strategy, however, runs the risk of a catastrophic confrontation if misinterpreted or if deterrence fails. Regional proliferation risks. Beyond the trilateral interplay, a nuclear Iran could spur other Middle Eastern states to seek their own deterrence. Saudi Arabia in particular has hinted it would pursue nuclear weapons if Iran does, which could unravel the global nonproliferation regime in the region. Thus, U.S. policy in 2025 to 2028 will also account for preventing a regional arms race. in negotiations, whether with Iran or in parallel deals, such as prospective U.S.-Saudi security pacts. The U.S. may offer incentives for restraint, for example, providing Saudi Arabia a civil nuclear program under strict controls to dissuade any weapons ambitions. Nonetheless, if Iran were seen as breaking out, Riyadh's strategic patience would vanish, further escalating the game with new players entering. In summary, the nuclear domain is the central arena of the US-Iran-Israel game. The next 3 years will likely force a resolution of some kind. Either a negotiated return to limits, a slide into open conflict, or a precarious continuation of the status quo. The current trajectory, absent a major course change, points toward a breaking point around 2025-2026, when snapback decisions, Iran's political calendar, and Israel's red lines converge. As one analysis succinctly put it, 2025 will be a decisive year for Iran's nuclear program, leading to a crossroads between a new deal or a clash that could involve Israel and the great powers. Risk of military conflict and cyber warfare. Aside from the nuclear file, the risk of military conflict, conventional or otherwise, among the trio remains high. The U.S., Iran, and Israel have been engaged in a low-level shadow war for years through proxy militias, covert operations, and cyber attacks, but a direct clash could erupt if deterrence breaks down. Here we assess the likelihood of different conflict scenarios through 2028, including open military confrontation, proxy wars, and cyber warfare, as well as the game theoretic logic guiding each side's decisions on using force. Direct military conflict scenarios. The most dangerous scenario is an outright war triggered by an Israeli or U.S. strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. Analysts and think tanks have war-gamed such a scenario extensively. One plausible trigger would be Israel launching a preventive airstrike campaign against Iran, as envisaged in scenario exercises in mid-2025, to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear capability. If Israel strikes, Iran is almost certain to retaliate against both Israeli and U.S. targets. Tehran tends to view Israel and America as jointly responsible. This could rapidly draw the United States in, either to support Israel or to protect its own forces in the region that might come under Iranian attack. In a recent RAND wargame simulation of an Israel-Iran war, it was found that escalation could be swift, with both sides even considering nuclear use if they felt existential threats, highlighting how quickly such a conflict could go out of control. American forces in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf would be on high alert for Iranian missile strikes and swarm attacks on Gulf shipping lanes. Iran, knowing it cannot win a head-on conventional war against Israel and the U.S., might employ an asymmetric counterpunch strategy, attacking through proxies, like Hezbollah barrages on Israel, or militia attacks on U.S. bases, and attempting to close the Strait of Hormuz to spike oil prices. However, Iranian leaders are keenly aware that a full confrontation with the U.S.-Israel coalition could be regime-ending. As one analysis notes, the Islamic Republic has always been intensely focused on its own survival, and has avoided truly suicidal aggression. Thus, game theory deterrence logic still holds. Iran may retaliate, but likely below the threshold that would trigger massive U.S. retaliation. For example, instead of directly targeting American cities, which Iran lacks capability for, aside from terrorism, it might strike U.S. ships or regional bases to send a message yet avoid an all-out U.S. invasion. The outcome of such a conflict scenario is difficult to predict. It could range from a short, sharp exchange, e.g. days or weeks of strikes until Iran is significantly set back and a ceasefire is brokered, to a wider regional war involving Lebanon, Syria, and beyond. A think tank scenario from the Middle East Institute posited that Israel's campaign could evolve into an effort to degrade Iran's security, economic, and political infrastructure, even aiming to enable regime change. In that scenario, Tehran would face a critical choice between escalation, risking collapse, and restraint. Most experts believe Iran would try to endure and outlast the assault rather than capitulate or escalate to doomsday levels. In essence, Tehran's likely play would be strategic endurance. Absorb the initial blows, preserve core regime elements, and avoid giving Israel, USA pretext for total war. Waiting for international pressure to impose a ceasefire. Historical analogies are Saddam Hussein's regime surviving the 1991 Gulf War, though weakened, or Assad's regime weathering intense conflict after 2012. In both cases the regimes endured by hunkering down, even at great cost. Proxy and indirect conflicts. Short of a direct war, conflict is likely to continue through proxy battles and missile strikes across the region. Iran has for decades pursued a strategy of forward defense by supporting non-state actors on Israel's borders, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Gaza, militias in Syria, to deter Israel and the U.S. Conversely, Israel, with U.S. tacit backing, has struck hundreds of Iranian or proxy targets in Syria and elsewhere to contain Iran's regional presence. Through 2025 to 2028, this shadow war could intensify, especially if hopes for diplomacy fade. We may see flare-ups in Syria. Israel might accelerate strikes on Iranian arms convoys and bases in Syria to prevent entrenchment, something it has been doing regularly, potentially clashing with Iranian or proxy forces there. In Iraq, pro-Iran militias could target remaining U.S. troops with rockets and IEDs, prompting U.S. During the simulated Israel-Iran clash in June 2025, reports indicated a surge of hacktivist and state-backed attacks on both sides. An Israeli-linked hacker group, Predatory Sparrow, claimed credit for disrupting an Iranian bank's operations and leaking tens of millions in stolen cryptocurrency to undermine Iranian financial stability. Iran's cyber actors meanwhile pushed disinformation into Israeli public networks, for example, sending fake emergency messages to Israeli citizens about non-existent terror attacks. In order to sow panic, U.S. agencies warned of increased Iranian hacktivist activity targeting U.S. networks as well, though largely low-level website defacements or ransomware rather than major infrastructure attacks. Going forward, cyber warfare is likely to be a primary arena for conflict short of shooting war. Iranian hackers may attempt to hit Israeli critical infrastructure, power grids, financial systems, or vice versa. Israeli and U.S. cyber units will target Iranian nuclear facilities' control systems, air defense networks, and propaganda channels. This is a domain where asymmetry can favor Iran to some extent. A small team of skilled hackers can cause outsized disruption. However, Iran's cyber record shows a mix of capable advanced persistent threat groups and proxy hacker collectives that can be potent but are met with equally sophisticated Israeli-U.S. cyber defenses. Game theoretic concept of stealth escalation applies here. Each side may try to gain advantage by ramping up cyber attacks, believing it might coerce the other without the visibility of kinetic attacks. The danger is that a particularly damaging cyberstrike, for instance, causing a major power outage or tampering with nuclear reactors, could be seen as an act of war by the victim, potentially prompting military retaliation. Thus, even in cyberspace, unwritten rules are emerging, e.g., Attacks causing physical destruction or loss of life are especially provocative. Through 2028, we can expect persistent cyber conflict as a backdrop. Constant espionage and occasional disruptive attacks will accompany any diplomatic impasse or military flare-up. Deterrence and conflict likelihood. Bringing these threads together. How likely is a major conflict by 2028? While the situation is volatile, the most likely outcome, barring a sudden diplomatic breakthrough, is continued sporadic clashes and covert war, rather than a full-scale declared war. All parties have strong incentives to avoid an uncontrollable war. Iran fears regime destruction. Israel fears the heavy losses even a victory would entail, from missiles raining down on its cities. And the US seeks to avoid another Middle East war that could cost lives and trillions. This aligns with what game theorists call a mutually hurting stalemate. None of the actors can achieve their maximal goals through force without suffering unacceptable damage themselves. Thus, despite heated rhetoric, a degree of restraint prevails. Even the hawkish actors act with one eye on the brink. Iran may harass tankers but not sink a U.S. One diplomatic angle to watch is Israel's normalization with Arab states. The Abraham Accords process. By 2025, Israel has peace or normalization with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and implicitly works with Saudi Arabia. Though not formal yet, the U.S. has been keen to broker an Israel-Saudi normalization, which would be a geopolitical coup isolating Iran further. However, the October 2023 Israel-Hamas war and ensuing regional tensions paused those talks. Looking ahead, if the Iranian threat grows, especially nuclear, Saudi Arabia and other Sunni Arab states may quietly align even more with Israel and the U.S. out of shared interest to contain Iran. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has signaled that while the Palestinian issue is a sticking point, an arrangement could be reached given enough incentives, e.g., U.S. security guarantees, defense cooperation, and perhaps concessions from Israel on the Palestinian front. Should a U.S.-Saudi-Israel understanding emerge, Iran will see this as a strategic encirclement. Tehran might respond by shoring up ties with remaining friends, e.g., deepen its China-Russia links, or try to win over countries like Qatar or Oman to its side. On the other hand, if conflict erupts, Israel-Iran war, Gulf states will be in a delicate spot. They fear Iran but also fear being battlefields. Notably, after an Israeli strike scenario in 2025, Saudi Arabia condemned Israel's attack and declined to help, even offering mediation. Gulf Arabs do not want a war next door, so their diplomacy might shift to crisis management, possibly restraining Israel or providing Iran a face-saving off-ramp. The bottom line is that the U.S. and Israel will attempt to expand the anti-Iran coalition via diplomacy, normalizing Israel with key Arab states, whereas Iran will try to crack that coalition by leveraging any Arab reluctance and by improving its own diplomatic image. Iran's surprise rapprochement with Saudi Arabia in 2023, brokered by China, was one such move. It lowered open hostilities with the Saudis and UAE, arguably to reduce the likelihood those states side with Israel in a conflict. Whether that détente holds under stress is uncertain. Saudi-Iran ties remain distrustful, but at least the communication channels are open now. Embassies reopened in 2023. It's conceivable that by 2028, the Middle East could have two loose blocks: a U.S.-Israel Arab alignment versus an Iran-led resistance camp. Or if diplomacy somehow improves, a more collective security dialogue including Iran. The latter would require significant de-escalation steps, like an Iran nuclear deal and Iran toning down proxy activity, which for now seem distant. International diplomatic front. On the broader stage, The role of Europe, the UN, and international law will also shape diplomacy. The Europeans, E3, UK, France, Germany, still officially support negotiating limits on Iran's nuclear program and have been frustrated by both Iran's violations and the US. These include secondary sanctions penalizing other countries for buying Iranian oil or doing business with Iranian banks and companies. The result was a sharp drop in Iran's oil exports and GDP from 2018 to 2020. Although the Biden administration in 2021 to 2024 was less aggressive in enforcement than the Trump administration, most sanctions remained in place. By 2025, Iran's oil exports have partially rebounded, estimated approximately 1.5 million barrels per day, mostly to China, but still below pre-2018 levels. Critically, Iran now sells the vast majority of its oil to China at a steep discount, creating a lifeline but also a dependency. Tehran's pivot to Eastern markets means it's somewhat insulated from Western pressure, but not pain-free. Discounts of $3-5 per barrel, as reported, cost Iran billions in lost revenue annually. Non-oil sectors also suffer from sanctions restricting access to international finance, technology, and investment. The effectiveness of sanctions so far has been mixed. On one hand, sanctions have unquestionably hurt Iran's economy. Inflation was running approximately 40% in early 2025. The currency, rial, hit historic lows, around 1 million rial per USD in the free market. Unemployment is high, especially among youth, and living standards have declined. This economic malaise has contributed to public discontent and protests inside Iran. On the other hand, sanctions have not achieved their primary strategic aim. They did not force Iran to capitulate on nuclear demands or collapse the regime. Iran responded to maximum pressure with its own maximum resistance, ramping up nuclear enrichment and regional harassment to gain leverage, rather than surrender. From a game theory perspective, the sanctions have been a punishment strategy by the US, hoping Iran would alter its strategy to escape economic pain. Iran instead adopted a grim tit-for-tat, reaching nuclear limits in return. The net result by 2025 is a stalemate where Iran's economy is under strain but the regime has adapted enough to survive, while the US has not achieved policy change and now faces an Iran closer to nuclear capability. This raises questions about continuing the same tactic versus adjusting. Sanctions outlook 2025 to 2028. In the absence of a new nuclear deal, the US and possibly Europe are likely to tighten sanctions further. By late 2024 and 2025, Washington began focusing on closing loopholes, for example, sanctioning Chinese firms involved in Iran oil trade. We can expect more of this enforcement focus going forward, particularly if a hawkish US administration takes office. That could mean aggressive targeting of Iran's remaining oil customers, China, and some smugglers feeding places like Syria, its petrochemical exports, and any countries, like UAE, Malaysia, etc., through which Iran does illicit financial transactions. The US Treasury may also deploy new tactics like secondary sanctions on banks that facilitate Iranian trade or cracking down on Iran's so-called shadow fleet of aging tankers that hide oil shipments. Israel, while not imposing sanctions itself, it lacks that global economic clout, will strongly lobby for tougher measures and share intel on sanction evasion networks. The European Union could also impose additional human rights sanctions, e.g., over Iran's crackdown on protesters or drone supplies to Russia, and might align with the US on certain financial restrictions if Iran's nuclear breaches become too egregious. Notably, If JCPOA snapback is invoked in 2025, all UN member states would be required, in theory, to reimpose sanctions per past UN resolutions, including an oil embargo and financial bans. However, snapback would be contentious. Russia and China would claim it illegitimate and may ignore it, and Europe itself might be split on the wisdom of snapback, since Iran has threatened NPT exit in response. Still, snapback would legally reinstate a broad sanctions regime that isolates Iran internationally, at least on paper. On the flip side, in a scenario of partial diplomatic progress, there could be selective sanctions relief. For example, an interim nuclear understanding might see the US allow Iran to repatriate or access a few $1 billion of its frozen funds abroad, or issue waivers enabling limited oil sales, in exchange for Iran freezing 60% enrichment. Already in 2023-2024, there were reports the US quietly allowed Iran to receive payment for Iraqi electricity debts and didn't fully enforce certain oil sanctions as a goodwill gesture during talks. If a formal deal is reached, one could envisage a phased lifting of major sanctions, unfreezing of overseas assets, suspension of oil sanctions, etc., similar to what happened after 2015. However, any relief will be contingent and reversible. Both sides have learned from experience. The US would insist on snapback mechanisms so sanctions reapply if Iran cheats. Iran would demand some shield against a future US pullout, though guarantees are hard given US politics. The net economic effect could be significant if done. Iran's economy might rebound with growth, currency stabilization, and improved trade, which in turn could reshape its strategic calculus. A less economically desperate Iran might reduce provocative actions, or conversely, could spend newfound funds on its military proxies, a key debate among policymakers. Sanctions and external actors. The effectiveness of US sanctions will also depend on Russia and China. These two great powers have increasingly undermined US sanctions by trading with Iran. China, as noted, buys Iranian oil, often disguised as other origins. Russia, under its own Western sanctions since the Ukraine war, has grown economically closer to Iran. The two trade in sanctioned goods and share financial workaround methods. In late 2022, Iran and Russia linked banking systems to bypass SWIFT, and Iran joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with Russia, China, and seeks BRICS membership to gain economic partners outside the West's orbit. From 2025 onward, we should expect China and Russia to continue throwing Iran economic lifelines, albeit cautiously. China, for instance, wants stable oil supplies and has strategic interest in keeping Iran out of the Western camp. But it also doesn't want a nuclear crisis that causes war or spiking oil prices. Thus, Beijing will likely calibrate, buying enough oil to sustain Iran, but not so openly as to provoke US sanctions on big Chinese banks, which could hurt China's own economy. Russia might step up military trade, possibly delivering advanced fighter jets or air defenses to Iran in exchange for drones and munitions. As has been happening, such deals help Iran somewhat militarily but don't solve its core economic woes. In sum, sanctions will continue to squeeze Iran, but complete isolation is impossible as long as major powers like China and Russia see benefit in economic engagement with Tehran. This means Iran's economy will likely muddle through, not thriving, but not collapsing either, unless additional shocks occur. Domestic economic pressures in Iran. For Iran's regime, the sanction-induced economic stress is a double-edged sword. On one side, it puts pressure on the leadership by fueling public anger. Ordinary Iranians see rising prices, job scarcity, and corruption. and many blame the regime's policies, both foreign and domestic mismanagement. This has led to waves of domestic unrest, which we will explore in the regime change section. On the other side, the regime has sometimes used sanctions as a scapegoat for internal problems and as a rallying cry for resistance. They portray economic hardship as a sacrifice in a noble struggle against U.S. oppression, attempting to invoke a kind of siege mentality, nationalism. There is evidence this narrative resonates with some of the base, but many Iranians remain frustrated, as seen in protest slogans that criticize spending on foreign militias while people at home suffer. Sanctions' effectiveness thus can't be measured only in GDP decline. It's also about political effects. So far, sanctions have not broken the IRGC or led to mass elite defections. Instead, the Revolutionary Guard and its affiliated businesses often find ways to profit via smuggling and black markets. Paradoxically, sanctions sometimes entrench corruption and black market profiteering, strengthening those in power who control illicit trade. Use of sanctions by Israel and U.S. as bargaining chips. Sanctions also serve as a bargaining chip. The U.S. can modulate sanctions to reward or punish. For instance, in 2023, when Iran slowed uranium enrichment slightly, the U.S. allowed Iran access to some frozen funds for humanitarian needs, signaling positive reinforcement. Conversely, new sanctions can be slapped swiftly if Iran acts aggressively, like drone attacks or hostage-taking. This dynamic will continue, a kind of economic game of carrot and stick. However, Iran has become somewhat inured to sanctions threats given it's been under them so long. Marginal utility of more sanctions may diminish. Iran might calculate that only truly existential pressure, like an imminent regime collapse economically, would justify major concessions. Short of that, they might try to endure until the U.S. political winds change, hoping for a less hostile administration or shifting global focus. In conclusion, economic sanctions will remain a key U.S.-Israeli strategy to contain Iran between now and 2028. They will likely be tightened, especially if diplomacy fails, contributing to Iran's strategic predicament. Sanctions' effectiveness will continue to be debated. They clearly weaken Iran's economy and thereby its ability to fund nuclear and military projects. But they also have not forced Iran to alter its core policies yet. The interplay of sanctions and diplomacy will be crucial. Any negotiated progress would involve some sanctions easing, whereas confrontation will bring more sanctions pain. For Israel and the U.S., sanctions are the primary non-military tool. For Iran, breaking sanctions, through diplomatic resolution or economic partnerships, is necessary to rescue its economy. Thus, the sanctions issue is tightly interwoven with all other domains. Nuclear conflict, domestic stability. A classic example of how economic statecraft influences the strategic game. Role of external powers. Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China. The trilateral U.S.-Iran-Israel relationship does not exist in a vacuum. External regional and global powers play significant roles that can alter incentives and outcomes. In this strategic triangle, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China stand out as particularly influential in the 2025 to 2028 timeframe, each with different interests and tools. We assess how each might affect the U.S.-Iran-Israel dynamic. Saudi Arabia. As the leading Sunni Arab power and Iran's regional rival, Saudi Arabia's actions will significantly influence the trilateral game. Riyadh's top concerns are Iran's regional aggression, such as missile, drone attacks and support for militants, and the potential of a nuclear-armed Iran upsetting the Gulf power balance. In recent years, Saudi policy toward Iran has fluctuated between confrontation and cautious engagement. On one hand, Saudi Arabia strongly supported the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign and quietly welcomed Israel's efforts to counter Iran, e.g., allowing Israeli overflights in some cases, sharing intelligence. On the other hand, stung by direct attacks, like the 2019 Iranian orchestrated strike on Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq, and uncertain of U.S. commitment to its defense, the Saudis pursued a diplomatic opening with Tehran. In 2023, with China's mediation, Riyadh and Tehran restored diplomatic relations and started dialogue to manage their disputes. This Saudi-Iran détente has led to some de-escalation, for instance, a more durable ceasefire in Yemen's war, where Iran-backed Houthi rebels had been firing missiles at Saudi targets. Over 2025 to 2028, Saudi Arabia will likely continue a hedging strategy, preparing for the worst, strengthening military, possibly cooperating with Israel, US on missile defense, but also keeping lines open to Tehran to avoid surprise attacks and perhaps to cool sectarian tensions. If Iran seriously moves toward a bomb, Saudi Arabia could react strongly. Saudi officials have warned they would seek their own nuclear capability if Iran cannot be prevented from nuclearization, possibly via a nuclear program of their own or even purchasing nuclear technology off the shelf. While such a step would be drastic and is not immediate, the U.S. might try to placate Riyadh by offering a formal defense pact or nuclear umbrella to dissuade them from proliferating. Saudi's influence is also crucial in the economic arena. It has sway in OPEC. If conflict with Iran brews, Saudi and UAE could increase oil production to stabilize prices or, conversely, might cut production to drive prices up depending on what stance they take. Politically, Saudi Arabia's position could determine the broader Arab world's reaction to a US-Iran or Israel-Iran showdown. If Saudi Arabia sides clearly with the US-Israel, for instance, providing logistical support or basing for operations, it isolates Iran further and could turn a bilateral conflict into a regional one. However, if Saudi Arabia remains neutral or calls for de-escalation, which it likely would publicly, to avoid domestic backlash and regional chaos, it could restrain the extent of conflict. In a scenario of potential US-brokered Israel-Saudi normalization, Saudi Arabia would probably demand US security guarantees against Iran and perhaps some progress on Palestinian issues. Achieving this deal would be a strategic blow to Iran. It would formalize an Israeli-Arab coalition that Iran has long tried to prevent. Iran would see Saudi-Israel ties as a direct threat and might retaliate by doubling down on outreach to other neighbors or inciting proxy pressure on Saudi interests, e.g., urging Houthis to end the ceasefire. In sum, Saudi Arabia can either be a stabilizer or an accelerant in the trilateral dynamic. A stabilizer if it mediates or stays neutral in conflicts and signals to both Washington and Tehran to show restraint. An accelerant if it fully joins the anti-Iran front or if it provokes Iran, or is provoked by Iran. Russia's involvement in this triangle comes from its roles as Iran's quasi-ally, as a great power competitor to the US, and as a player in Middle East conflicts, Syria, etc. Moscow and Tehran have a partnership largely born of common enemies: the West, Sunni jihadists, and convenience. In Syria, Russia and Iran fought on the same side to prop up Assad. In the Ukraine war context, Iran has supplied drones to Russia, and Russia in return has promised advanced jets and possibly air defense systems to Iran. Russia's interest in the US-Iran-Israel dynamics is guided by a few aims: undermining US influence, maintaining stability in regions where it has interests, like avoiding a war that could disrupt its operations in Syria or oil prices in a way it doesn't control, and economic opportunism, arms sales, nuclear reactor projects like Bushehr, etc. Through 2028, Russia is likely to shield Iran diplomatically. For example, at the UN Security Council, Russia will veto or dilute any resolutions punishing Iran. If snapback is attempted, Russia will declare it invalid and encourage others to ignore UN sanctions. It already has taken steps. After October 2023, when a UN ban on Iran's missile trade expired, Russia moved ahead to potentially sell Iran fighter jets, knowing Western objections carry little weight. In a conflict scenario, Russia might try to play mediator to enhance its international standing, or at least use the situation to its advantage. For instance, a Middle East war that spikes oil prices would benefit Russia as an oil exporter, though too high a spike could cause demand destruction. However, Russia would not want to see Iran defeated or the regime toppled by a US-Israeli war, as that could bring a pro-West government to Tehran or at least remove a thorn in America's side, which Iran currently is. So Moscow might covertly aid Iran, perhaps providing intelligence or accelerating arms deliveries to bog down any Israeli-US military action. But it would likely stop short of direct military intervention against US-Israel forces, as that could trigger a great power war. Instead, Russia's more plausible influence is political and economic. It will trade more with Iran if Iran faces tighter sanctions, becoming a key market for Iranian goods and a source of embargoed items also. If the US is distracted by Iran, Russia might get more freedom of action in Ukraine or elsewhere, so it has a subtle interest in a simmering US-Iran crisis, though not a nuclear holocaust. One risk is the Russia-Israel relationship. Historically, Israel has maintained working ties with Moscow, particularly to the conflict in Syria. But if Israel is at war with Iran and Iran is Russia's wartime partner, supplying drones, etc., those relations could sour. Russia might then greenlight more hostile actions by Syria or others against Israel. Conversely, if tensions stay below war, Israel will likely keep engaging Russia, e.g. asking Russia to restrain Iran in Syria in exchange for Israel not arming Ukraine heavily. In summary, Russia benefits from a level of tension that occupies the US and bonds Iran closer to it, and it will act to obstruct Western pressure on Iran. But it likely does not want an uncontrolled war that could destabilize the region and global oil markets too severely or risk direct US-Russia clashes. China's influence is expansive and nuanced. China is a top customer of Middle Eastern oil and has growing strategic interests through its Belt and Road Initiative. Its approach to the US-Iran-Israel triangle is driven by securing energy supplies, expanding geopolitical influence at America's expense, and maintaining regional stability for commerce. China has maintained good relations with Iran, calling it a comprehensive strategic partner, while also having strong ties with Israel, especially in technology and infrastructure investment, and with Arab states, major trade and projects. Beijing often advocates for diplomatic solutions and non-interference, positioning itself as a potential peacemaker. A striking example was China's brokered Saudi-Iran normalization in 2023, a move that caught Washington off guard and signaled China's arrival as a diplomatic player in the Middle East from 2025 to 2028. Expect China to increase its involvement. It may push multilateral talks or forums for Gulf security where the US isn't the sole leader. China likely fears an Iran-US-Israel war because it could disrupt oil flows. China imports significant oil from the Gulf and cause global economic turbulence. High oil prices hurt China's economy, and conflict could also force China into awkward balancing or even jeopardize Chinese nationals' projects in the region. Therefore, if a crisis escalates, China could use its leverage in Tehran, and to a lesser extent in Riyadh, to urge restraint. Beijing's leverage comes from its economic clout. Iran relies on China for oil revenue and investment, e.g. a 25-year cooperation deal was signed in 2021. Though progress is slow, if China threatened to curtail oil purchases or delay projects, Iran would feel the pinch. But China would do that only if Iran's actions truly threatened China's interests. More likely, China will continue to provide Iran an economic lifeline, buying oil in yuan or via barter to bypass sanctions, thus reducing U.S. pressure effectiveness. Strategically, China enjoys the U.S.-Iran antagonism to an extent, since it keeps the U.S. bogged down in the Middle East and distracts from the Indo-Pacific. However, China does not want Iran to actually get nuclear weapons, because that might provoke a war or a nuclear arms race in its broader neighborhood on its western flank, and could embolden more defiance of non-proliferation norms, which China, as a nuclear power, has an interest in maintaining to some degree. So China has quietly supported past agreements to limit Iran's program. It was a party to the JCPOA and largely complied with it. In the future, China might try to broker between the US and Iran if talks stall, offering perhaps economic sweeteners or security assurances. For instance, China could propose a regional dialogue that includes Iran, Israel, and Gulf states focused on Persian Gulf maritime security or a mutual non-aggression pact. While the U.S. might be skeptical of a China-led initiative, regional players may welcome any avenue that reduces war risk. China's deepening ties in the Middle East mean its voice carries weight. By 2028, we could see it as a co-mediator in any new nuclear accord or conflict resolution talks, marking a shift from U.S.-centric diplomacy. In summary, China will work to prevent an explosive conflict and use its economic ties to Iran to keep Iran afloat, all while expanding its own influence as a power broker. If successful, this could constrain U.S. and Israeli options somewhat. They might need to consider Beijing's reactions, adding a new layer to the game. Other regional powers. Although the prompt highlights Saudi, Russia, China, it's worth briefly noting others. Europe, EU, as mentioned, will mostly align with U.S. policy but try to moderate extremes. Turkey is a wild card. Ankara has its rivalry with Iran but also cooperates at times. It might exploit chaos to assert itself or mediate if it sees benefit. Other Gulf states, UAE, Qatar, etc., have roles. UAE has engaged with Israel and also kept dialogue with Iran. Like Saudi, hedging both sides, Qatar often mediates with Iran and could serve as a go-between for the U.S. Given Qatar's ties to Washington and Tehran, Egypt and Jordan watch carefully but are removed. They fear Iran's influence but are domestically focused. In essence, external powers can either reinforce pressure on Iran, as Israel, US want, or dilute it, and they can either contain a conflict or widen it. Saudi Arabia's stance will influence the Arab world's tilt. Russia and China can offset Western pressure and complicate US strategy. And China in particular might emerge as a key stabilizer if it chooses to invest diplomatic capital in preventing war. The interplay of these external influences will be integral to how the next few years unfold in this high-stakes trilateral relationship. Scenario analysis. Plausible futures. 2025 to 2028. Given all the above domains and influences, we can outline several plausible scenarios for how the US-Iran-Israel relationship might evolve over the next 3 years. Each scenario integrates nuclear, military, diplomatic, and domestic factors in different ways. We then assess which outcomes are most likely based on current trajectories and strategic decision-making patterns. Scenario 1. Stalemate and containment. Cold conflict continues. Description. In this scenario, no dramatic breakthroughs or breakdowns occur. The status quo of confrontation short of war continues. Iran does not build a nuclear bomb, but also no new comprehensive deal is reached. Instead, a shaky interim understanding might keep Iran's enrichment around 60% and prevent the situation from boiling over. Israel does not launch major attacks on Iran, absent an explicit Iranian dash to weapons, but continues covert sabotage and occasional strikes on Iranian assets in Syria or at sea. And Iran hammer out a new agreement by 2026. It might not be as ambitious as JCPOA but is enough to mitigate the immediate crisis. For instance, Iran could agree to roll back enrichment to 20% and export or downblend its 60% stockpile. And in return the US would lift oil sanctions and unfreeze tens of billions of Iran's assets. Strict IAEA monitoring would resume to verify compliance. Israel, while not happy with any Iranian enrichment, tacitly accepts the deal as it meaningfully extends Iran's breakout timeline, perhaps back to several months or more, and averts an Iranian bomb in the near term. In exchange, the US might bolster Israel's qualitative military edge further as reassurance. Diplomatic relations don't fully normalize. Iran still opposes Israel ideologically, and the US-Iran mistrust remains, but there is a noticeable thaw. Perhaps there are even direct high-level talks for the first time. E.g., a meeting on the sidelines of the UN. Regionally, reduced US-Iran hostility enables some de-escalation. In Iraq and Syria, proxy clashes decrease. In Yemen, a peace deal becomes permanent as Iran and Saudi feel less compelled to compete there. The economic windfall for Iran from sanctions relief strengthens pragmatic voices in Tehran who prioritize recovery over revolutionary adventurism. Iran's GDP grows, and this, ironically, could stabilize the regime by easing public anger, though it also raises popular expectations for better governance. Israel focuses on integrating into a prospering region, leveraging the period of reduced Iranian threat to advance tech and trade partnerships, maybe even with a cautiously opening Iran. If entrepreneurial links quietly resume. Likelihood and preconditions. This scenario likely requires a specific alignment of political will. Perhaps a moderate pragmatist gains Iran's presidency in 2025. The Atlantic Council piece speculated about a President Pezeshkian, a more moderate figure, understanding the need for economic relief, combined with a U.S. administration willing to invest political capital in an Iran deal. Even a returning Trump might paradoxically do so, seeking a Trump deal trophy. It also might need external coaxing. China and Russia could encourage Iran to accept a deal, while Europe encourages U.S. flexibility. While not impossible, this scenario faces serious skepticism. Hardliners in Tehran and Washington could sabotage it, and Israel's acceptance would hinge on the deal being strict and long-lasting. Still, it's plausible as a temporary strategic truce. If achieved, by 2028 we could see a far less volatile Middle East environment, not friendly, but at least with the nuclear crisis diffused and open war avoided. This would be the most positive outcome for global stability, though hawks would argue it only kicks the can down the road unless it leads to follow-on agreements addressing missiles and Iran's regional activities. Scenario 3. Escalation to war. Description. This is the worst-case trajectory where deterrence fails and conflict erupts. It could unfold in various ways. But one likely pathway is, in late 2025 or 2026, Iran is caught taking a provocative nuclear step, say, enriching a small amount to 90% or expelling IAEA inspectors after a snapback move. Israel, possibly with tacit U.S. approval, launches a preemptive airstrike campaign against Iran's nuclear sites and key military assets. This initiates a hot war between Israel and Iran. Iran retaliates with missile salvos at Israeli cities and military bases, and directs Hezbollah to open a northern front against Israel. The United States, seeing its ally under heavy attack and its bases in the region threatened. Iran might also strike Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar or Al Dhafra in UAE where U.S. forces are, or attempt to hit the U.S. Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. Intervenes militarily. The conflict expands. Intensive Israeli strikes aim to eliminate Iran's nuclear facilities and decapitate IRGC leadership. The Brookings scenario of June 2025 imagined Israel swiftly neutralizing Iranian air defenses and top generals. The U.S. focuses on suppressing Iran's ability to retaliate, hitting missile launch sites, naval units, and perhaps command and control. Iran, overwhelmed in direct confrontation, seeks to widen the war. It calls on Shia militias in Iraq and Syria to attack U.S. troops, encourages Houthi attacks on Saudi, UAE, and appeals to sentiment in the Muslim world by framing the war as U.S.-Israeli aggression, possibly launching terror attacks or inciting unrest in countries with significant Shia populations. Like Bahrain, initially, Israel achieves significant blows to Iran's nuclear program. Natanz and other sites are heavily damaged, setting back the program by years. However, Iran's missile retaliation, though somewhat blunted by Israeli missile defense, causes damage and casualties in Israel. Cyber attacks from Iran also disrupt infrastructure in Israel and the U.S., perhaps temporarily downing parts of the power grid or financial systems. The region's economy reels, oil prices skyrocket as Iran tries to mine the Strait of Hormuz. After some weeks of intense conflict, international pressure, even from Russia and China, who do not want this war, mounts for a ceasefire. Perhaps the U.S. and Israel refrain from a full regime-toppling invasion, content with crippling Iran's nuclear and military for now. A ceasefire is reached but not before thousands are dead, including civilians in Iran from the airstrikes, and in Israel from missile hits. This scenario could also involve nuclear danger. If Iran feared regime collapse, it could consider a crash program to assemble a crude nuclear device or at least withdraw from the NPT formally to scare adversaries. Conversely, if Iran somehow had an operational nuclear missile, unlikely without prior testing, there would be a risk of consideration of last resort use, but as noted, Iran hasn't been suicidal historically, so likely not. Outcome by 2028, in the aftermath, Iran would be badly weakened, much of its nuclear infrastructure destroyed, its economy shattered by both bombing and even harsher new sanctions. The regime might or might not survive. One possibility is the regime remains but in a much more isolated, besieged state, like Saddam after 1991. Or the May scenario's strategic endurance, where Iran survives but as a contained threat. Over time that could lead to regime decay or collapse. But not immediately. Israel would emerge militarily victorious but at high cost. Some of its cities hit, and facing international criticism for the war's destruction. The U.S. might achieve its goal of stopping Iran's nuclear program, but at the cost of another Middle East conflagration, global economic fallout, and potentially long-term insurgent or terror blowback from Iran or its proxies. This war scenario, while the least desirable, is plausible if miscalculation or hardline leadership decisions come to the fore. For example, an Israeli leadership convinced that time is up or an Iranian leadership that underestimates Israel's resolve could set this in motion. Likelihood. Not the base case, but non-trivial. Perhaps it becomes likely if no diplomatic progress and if Iran's program crosses certain thresholds, or if a very hawkish U.S.-Israeli government comes into power and preempts. War game analyses consistently warn that once started, such a war would be unpredictable and could destroy the Middle East, as even former U.S. President Trump reportedly assessed. This acts, hopefully, as a caution to present decision-makers to avoid this path. Scenario 4. Iranian internal transformation. Description. This scenario focuses on a major change coming from within Iran, essentially a form of regime change or evolution, and how that would alter the trilateral dynamic. The catalyst could be one of several possibilities. The death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is in his mid-80s, a succession struggle within the elite, or a massive popular uprising that forces a change in governance. If, say, Khamenei dies in 2026, it could open a power vacuum. In one version of this scenario, more pragmatic elements in the regime, perhaps aligned with technocrats or a faction of the Revolutionary Guard, take control and move Iran towards a less ideologically rigid foreign policy. They might decide that building nuclear weapons or maintaining hostility with the world is endangering regime survival, so they pivot, agreeing to new limits on the nuclear program, cooling rhetoric against Israel, and focusing on rebuilding the economy. This would be a sort of controlled reform from above, possibly with a new supreme leader who is a little more flexible, or even a leadership council that includes moderate voices. Another version is a popular revolution that topples the Islamic Republic. More on feasibility in the regime change section. If a more democratic or secular-leaning government replaced the current regime, Iran's foreign policy could change fundamentally. It might seek rapprochement with the West and even at least cease hostile acts towards Israel. Though normalization with Israel would be controversial domestically for any Iranian government, given historic support for Palestinians. Under either internal change scenario, the calculus of the U.S. and Israel would shift dramatically. If the new Iranian leadership renounces nuclear weapons ambitions and supports a renewed stringent agreement, Israel's existential threat perception would lessen and the U.S. would rush to integrate Iran back into the international community, much like post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s, albeit hopefully with a better outcome. This could, by 2028, lead to full sanctions lifting and an economic boom in Iran. Deeper Iran Gulf Arab détente. The Saudis and others would welcome a non-revolutionary Iran, and removal of the main rationale for U.S.-Iran military conflict. However, these optimistic outcomes assume a stable and benign transition in Iran, which is far from guaranteed. A darker variant is an unstable transition. If Khamenei's death leads to infighting, Iran could become chaotic or more aggressive externally as factions compete. Some might accelerate nuclear pursuit to rally nationalist support. Or if a revolution happens, it could devolve into civil conflict. Iran is multi-ethnic, and various groups like Kurds, Baluch, etc., might push for autonomy if central control weakens. That could ironically create new security headaches, loose weapons, refugee flows, etc. For Israel and the U.S. A collapsing Iran might pose short-term risks even if they hope for a better eventual government. They would have to secure nuclear materials to prevent theft or misuse, and might see opportunistic moves by Russia or others to influence the outcome. Likelihood. A significant internal change in Iran by 2028 is possible but hard to handicap. The regime has proven resilient in face of protests. But Khamenei's succession is a critical unknown. Game theory doesn't easily predict internal upheaval. But one can say the regime's strategy so far has been successful in survival. Only a major shock, economic collapse or a split in the armed forces' loyalty, might break that equilibrium. If this scenario were to occur, it could either be an unexpected positive game-changer, removing the root causes of conflict, or a source of short-term instability with long-term benefits. Scenario 5. Hybrid, partial war. Partial deal. Real-world outcomes might not fit neatly into one scenario. For completeness, we consider a hybrid outcome. For example, a limited conflict erupts, perhaps a contained exchange of strikes in 2026 that lasts a week or two. Akin to the 12-day war scenario discussed by analysts, which, while destructive, does not escalate into full regime change or regional war. After this sharp shock, all sides pull back, and this very conflict shock then spurs diplomacy. Maybe a ceasefire leads to emergency talks, where Iran, bruised, agrees to some nuclear concessions, and the US-Israel agree to pause military action. Essentially, a short war acts as brutal negotiation leading to a new status quo. This could leave Iran's nuclear program significantly set back, solving Israel's immediate problem, but without toppling the regime. And then a cold truce follows. During 2027-2028, an uneasy peace holds. Iran rebuilds some, but carefully, and the US-Israel refrain from further strikes as long as Iran complies with whatever terms ended the fighting, perhaps shipping out all 60% enriched uranium and allowing intrusive inspections. Meanwhile, economic sanctions might still largely remain, with perhaps a few eased for humanitarian reasons. So Iran's recovery is limited, and the fundamental rivalry persists. This scenario basically combines elements of conflict and diplomacy. It's plausible because in history we often see limited wars, e.g., the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, leading to subsequent negotiations, Camp David, etc. It recognizes that sometimes parties only compromise after a demonstration of force. The downside is, of course, those who suffer in that demonstration. Most likely scenarios, assessment. Based on current trajectories in mid-2025. Scenario 1. Continued stalemate, appears the most likely barring significant changes. The players have so far managed to avoid both grand compromise and full war, settling into a pattern of contained conflict. Unless Iran's nuclear advances force a hand or a political shift occurs, this pattern may well extend a few more years. Scenario 2. Diplomatic breakthrough is next in desirability but harder to achieve. It likely requires either a crisis to concentrate minds or leadership changes that favor deal-making. Scenario 3. Open war, while not anyone's preference, cannot be ruled out if miscalculations accumulate. Its probability is lower, but the consequences so high that it looms in everyone's strategic calculus, hopefully as a deterrent. Scenario 4. Internal change in Iran is a wildcard. It could dramatically reset the entire game, but forecasting revolutionary timing is notoriously difficult. It's a low to moderate likelihood scenario within this short timeframe, but one with profound impact if it occurs. In policy terms, many strategies, US sanctions, Israeli information operations, are arguably aimed at nudging this outcome. But externally induced regime change is unlikely. It would have to come largely from Iranian society or elite dynamics. In any event, all scenarios require flexibility from decision makers and present both opportunities and risks. An adaptive strategy for the US and Israel would be to prepare for the worst. Strengthen deterrence and defensive measures in case of war, while keeping doors open for the best. Diplomatic engagement if openings arise. And supporting any positive political evolution in Iran. From Iran's perspective, the rational course is to avoid giving Israel, USA pretext for war while trying to break out of economic strangulation, which logically points toward some negotiated relief. However, regime ideology and threat perceptions may impede that logic. Having mapped these scenarios, we now turn to one of the most critical variables underpinning them: the potential for regime change in Iran, which could either be a scenario of its own or a factor reshaping all others. Prospects for regime change in Iran, 2025 to 2028. The question of regime change in Iran, meaning the end of the Islamic Republic's rule and its replacement by a substantially different governing system, is a subject of intense speculation and interest, especially in the West and among Iran's regional adversaries. In analyzing the potential for such a change by 2028, we consider historical precedents, current internal pressures, economic hardships and public unrest, and the cohesion or fractures among Iran's ruling elites. Historical precedents. Iran's modern history offers one clear example of a wholesale regime change: the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which toppled the Shah's monarchy and installed the current theocratic system. That revolution was enabled by a combination of factors: broad-based public discontent cutting across classes, from secular liberals to religious traditionalists, economic strains, inflation and inequality in the Shah's final years, the Shah's own declining health and wavering will, and crucially, a unified opposition narrative under Ayatollah Khomeini's leadership which brought disparate groups together against the regime. Since 1979, the Islamic Republic itself has faced serious protests, notably in 1999. Student protests. 2009. The Green Movement after a disputed election. 2017-2018. Economic protests in provincial cities. 2019. The Bloody November fuel price protests. And 2022-2023. The nationwide unrest after Mahsa Amini's death, centered on demands for social freedom and women's rights. None of these have, yet, amounted to a revolution. A key reason is that unlike 1979, the post-revolution opposition in Iran has been fragmented and lacked leadership. As one analyst put it, the regime endures due to sheer brutality and lack of an organized alternative. The Revolutionary Guard and security forces remain loyal and willing to brutally suppress dissent. And opposition groups, be they monarchists, reformists, or ethnic dissidents, are divided in vision and often operate in exile. Unable to coordinate a nationwide movement inside the country. Economic pressures. Iran's economy is under significant strain, largely due to sanctions but also mismanagement and corruption. Inflation above 30 to 40% erodes purchasing power. The currency's collapse, reaching around 1 million rial per USD in early 2025, is a visible sign to Iranians of economic failure. Unemployment, especially youth unemployment, is high. Many educated young Iranians see no future and emigrate if they can. These conditions create a fertile ground for anger. Economic grievance has indeed been a driver of protests. E.g., the 2017-18 and 2019 protests were initially about prices and subsidies. There's a concept in political science that when economic expectations consistently fail to be met, people may lose fear and pour into streets, a phenomenon some saw in Eastern Europe 1989, Arab Spring 2011, etc. In Iran, sanctions have limited the regime's resources to co-op society, like providing jobs or subsidies. which could over time weaken the social contract. For now, the government has managed to muddle through, using repression, some cash handouts, and blaming foreign enemies for hardships. But if conditions worsen further, imagine snapback sanctions cutting oil exports to near zero or hyperinflation. Spontaneous unrest could become more frequent and widespread. The Klingendale Institute noted in a scenario analysis that deteriorating economic conditions create a real possibility of social unrest, especially given no prospect of relief. Importantly, economic pain can also exacerbate rifts among elites if different factions start blaming each other for failure. Domestic unrest and social trends. The societal trends in Iran show a populace that is, on average, young, educated, and increasingly at odds with the regime's strict ideology. The 2022 Woman, Life, Freedom protests after Mahsa Amini's death in morality police custody demonstrated the depth of resentment, especially over social restrictions like compulsory hijab. Those protests spread to over 100 cities and lasted for months, with women and youth at the forefront and slogans even calling for the death of the dictator. Khamenei. The regime eventually suppressed that wave through mass arrests, harsh sentences, even executions of protesters, and an intimidation campaign. However, the undercurrents remain. Many Iranian women now quietly defy hijab laws, and the legitimacy of the clerical rule is openly questioned in private if not public. This indicates a chronic legitimacy crisis for the regime. That said, will public discontent crystallize into regime change? It requires organization and leadership. Observers have pointed out that the Iranian opposition is highly fragmented. Some want a restored monarchy under the exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. Some want a secular republic. Others might accept a reformed Islamic republic without the current supreme leader structure. As an Iranian analyst, Ray Takei quipped, Iran always has a transition in front of it, never behind it, highlighting how change always seems on the horizon but hasn't happened. A recent analysis by ABC News, Australia, emphasized that for the people to overthrow the regime, there needs to be a unifying leadership or vision, which currently is lacking. In 1979, Khomeini played that unifying role. Today, no single figure has comparable broad appeal. The exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi has name recognition but polarizes opinions. Monarchy versus republic debates. Inside Iran, reformist politicians like former President Mohammad Khatami or even the once insider-turned-dissident Mir Hossein Mousavi have some following, but the hardliners have effectively marginalized them. Mousavi has been under house arrest for years. Human rights activists like 2023 Nobel laureate Nargiz Mohammadi are heroic figures. But again, from prison they can only inspire, not organize a revolution. A piece in The American Conservative argued that a regime implosion could open space for jihadists and instability that might endanger America by creating another failed state environment for extremism. Israeli officials have at times privately expressed ambivalence about regime change, preferring an isolated, diterable Iran to an unpredictable revolutionary situation. This underscores that external powers might not be prepared for the day after, even if they rhetorically cheer on Iran's protesters. Timeframe of 2025 to 2028, within 3 years. What is the chance the regime falls? Not high, unless compounding crises hit. However, the probability is not zero. If we imagine some triggers, Khamenei's death could be one. If it occurs and leads to a contentious succession, the leadership might be too distracted to address a popular uprising or may fracture among themselves. Another trigger, a major war, as in Scenario 3. that could either rally nationalist support in short term or, if Iran is humiliated, could delegitimize the regime greatly. The May scenario suggested that Israel's war aimed in part to encourage regime change by so thoroughly battering Iran's security apparatus and economy that the people or some elites rise up. While the regime might initially rally around the flag against an external attack, a defeat could later spark serious questioning of the leadership's competence. Historical parallel. Argentina's military regime lost the Falklands War in 1982 and fell soon after due to loss of legitimacy. Conceivably, a badly handled conflict with Israel, U.S. could do the same to Iran's regime. Economic collapse is another possible slow burn trigger, if oil exports drop further and no relief. The government might literally struggle to pay security forces, which is dangerous for regime continuity. Already Iran's budget is strained, a large portion goes to security. But if hyperinflation or currency freefall accelerates, even those on government payroll might become disaffected. Analyst opinions. Experts on Iran often assert that predicting the fall of regimes is a fool's errand. Many thought the Islamic Republic wouldn't last beyond the 1980s. Yet here it is over 40 years old. However, others point out that the regime today is arguably at its weakest point in decades on several fronts. More vulnerable than at any time since 1979, as one Washington Institute memo put it, citing lack of legitimacy and fatigue among its proxies. The same memo paradoxically noted Iran has never been closer to a bomb, implying a regime desperate for a security guarantee. This vulnerability plus nuclear proximity dynamic can either make the regime more dangerous, if cornered, it lashes out or arms up, or more prone to concession, if it fears internal collapse more than external threat. Conclusion on regime change potential. While the Islamic Republic could indeed fall under the cumulative weight of public dissent, economic misery, and elite infighting, the most likely outcome by 2028 is continuity of the current regime, unless one of the high-impact triggers occurs. That continuity might come at the cost of increasingly harsh measures. For instance, even more brutal crackdowns. The regime has already been imprisoning and executing protesters and surveilling citizens. Efforts to further ideologically indoctrinate or intimidate the populace, and doubling down on alliances with other autocracies for survival techniques. The possibility of a soft coup, where a faction internally forces some changes, is a bit higher than a mass revolution, especially around succession. We could see by 2028 perhaps a new supreme leader who, while from within the establishment, recognizes the need to ease tensions abroad to focus on economy, similar to how Chinese leadership post-Mao shifted course. That could be a semi-regime change in effect. Policy change without structural revolution. If regime change were to happen, it would profoundly alter the US-Iran-Israel relationship. Presumably, the primary sources of conflict, nuclear ambitions, Iran's anti-Israel stance, would diminish if a friendlier or at least less aggressive regime took power in Tehran. But the path to that outcome is fraught with uncertainties and dangers. As one opinion writer mused, if Iran overnight became peaceful and US-friendly, it would ironically remove the scarecrow that the US and Israel have used to justify certain policies and regional alignments. That is speculative, but it highlights that regime change, while desired by many outside Iran, could produce complex ripple effects. In sum, the potential for regime change in Iran exists but should not be presumed. The regime has so far demonstrated a brutal will to survive, and spontaneous revolution is hard without organization. Economic and social pressures are mounting, making the regime increasingly brittle. Should an opportunity present, like a leadership transition or a moment of weakness, An accelerated push by domestic forces could end the Islamic Republic. However, prudent policy from the US and Israel must plan for scenarios both where the regime persists, and thus focus on deterrence and containment, and where it falls, planning to secure nuclear materials, avoid chaos, and engage a new Iran. Conclusion. Over the next 3 years, the trilateral relationship of the US, Iran, and Israel will be defined by a delicate balance of confrontation and caution. Game theory illuminates their interactions as a high-stakes strategic game, each actor seeking to maximize security and strategic advantage without triggering an irreversible catastrophe. Nuclear policy will remain the flashpoint. Iran's nuclear advances push the game toward a dangerous edge, while US and Israeli counterstrategies aim to raise the costs of that path for Iran. The most likely trajectory absent dramatic shifts is a continuance of the uneasy status quo, a simmering conflict kept below boiling point by mutual deterrence and intermittent diplomacy. In this scenario, all parties tolerate a degree of impasse. Iran refrains from weaponizing its nuclear program, staying in the strategic prison of ambiguity. Israel holds off on overt military action, and the US contains Iran through sanctions and regional coalitions. This is essentially a Cold War-like state, not peace, but managed hostility. However, the situation is inherently unstable. Alternative scenarios could quickly materialize. A collapse of diplomacy combined with aggressive moves could spiral into open conflict, a scenario whose likelihood may be moderate but whose impact would be devastating. Conversely, pragmatic decision-making or changes in leadership could unlock diplomatic solutions that seemed out of reach, reducing risks for all sides. External powers will shape these outcomes at the margins. China and Russia act as stabilizers or spoilers in different ways, and regional players like Saudi Arabia can either facilitate a united front or mediate détente. One of the most unpredictable variables is Iran's internal evolution. Should Iran experience significant political change, whether through a reformist shift or a revolutionary upheaval, it would rewrite the rules of the game entirely. A post-Islamic Republic government inclined toward normal relations would remove the root cause of US-Iran and Israel-Iran enmity, potentially heralding a new era of reduced tensions in the Middle East. Yet, banking on regime change within a specific timeframe is precarious. History cautions that entrenched regimes often appear unshakable until they suddenly crumble. But they can also long outlast external expectations. In strategic terms, each actor will continue to use a mix of coercion and incentives to steer the next moves. Like if you found this helpful. Comment which story you want covered in depth next. Don't forget to subscribe.